Well, everybody, welcome back from morning tea. I hope you enjoyed the repast that our kind sponsor Telstra put on. Before we get into the next session, if I might grab your attention momentarily, look deeply into the eyes of the person next to you, perhaps rest a gentle hand on their arm and say, "You're still talking." And I know this guy likes to call out tables that are still talking. He's quite horrible when provoked. Okay, so the guy at the back of the room... No. In the beginning there was housekeeping, folks. Don't forget, and this is quite an important part of what we're doing here today, we'd love you to SMS your questions if you don't feel like asking one directly. So as a question arises in your elegant mind, the number to send it to is 0427541357. That's 0427541357. And I've got to say, I had a quick look on LinkedIn. I got 11 likes for my post before. That's feeling like the wet lettuce of the digital age there. Great news that we're going really, really well on Twitter though. So keep that going. Our next session is sponsored by our major sponsor, Liberty One Steel, and before we commence we've got a short video featuring Neil Gibson, the Executive General Manager, Steel Manufacturing and Integration at Liberty One Steel, discussing the relationship between construction trends and the changing face of Australian communities.
So the industry's looking for sustainable solutions, and that's what we provide at Liberty One Steel. So the triple line sustainability agenda that is being run by consumers and also industry fits very much with what we're doing at Liberty. We have a very clear strategy around our green steel approach, which is to create jobs locally using recycled steel, producing steel locally, using renewable sources of power from our Simac Energy business, making sure that we are creating sustainable solutions, a sustainable industry for steel making, manufacturing, production and processing in Australia. The other thing we want to do is to make sure that the supply chain continues to innovate and is sustainable by offering flexible and sustainable solutions, working very closely with our construction partners in the industry in Australia.
Thank you again, Neil and Liberty One Steel. I'm now delighted to introduce our next session, Driving Ethical Investment Beyond the Boardroom. Please welcome to the stage our moderator, the fantastic Narelle Hooper, advisor, author, director and editor-in-chief of Company Director magazine. Make her warmly welcome, please. Great to see you again.
Good morning, everybody. The topic today, as Mark said, is driving ethical investment beyond the boardroom. And there's two sides to this. There's risk and there's opportunity. Sometimes we forget the massive opportunity, but the way of coming to this today, there's as you know, there's a shifting mood in society. The Me Too movement is an example of a reckoning that's happening with the way we've done some things now. That seems a long way from what we're talking about, ethical investing. But the similar issues about bringing to light some of the things we've traditionally done in operating our businesses, and they require a coming to grips with and a new way of operating. I'm delighted to host this next panel. I have three excellent minds to help us. We have Emma Hurd, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Investor Group on Climate Change. We have Professor David Kinley, the Chair in Human Rights Law of the Faculty of Law at the University of Sydney. And we have Harry Cho, she's the Director and Head of Sustainable Finance Asia for ING Bank. And by way of framing up this session, if you go from carbon to coal, from climate risk to modern slavery, boards are shining a corporate light into some dark corners. And we start to ask, how can ethical investment transform three areas: corporate strategy, how it can strengthen stakeholder relationships, and how it can add value to companies and communities. Now, I had some reckoning to do at first with this discussion. I thought I was ethically investing in my superannuation. And I had to ask some other questions on that. So we'll get into that topic in a little more detail. I'd first like to welcome Emma Hurd, Chief Executive Officer for the Investor Group on Climate Change, to open our session, and then we'll proceed with the others. Thank you.
Good morning, and I feel very short all of a sudden. Good morning, and thanks very much for the invitation to speak today. It's always a pleasure to be at the Green Cities event. It's such a diverse range of topics and such a fantastic lineup of speakers. I always feel very privileged to be invited to join the panels such as today's to talk about these sorts of issues. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the Investor Group on Climate Change, we are an industry association representing institutional investors specifically across Australia and New Zealand. We have today around 65 members representing over 2 trillion in assets under management, specifically focused on the issue of climate change. We've been around for about 13 years now and have spent quite a bit of that time looking at the E in the ESG, or the environment in the environment, social and governance, or the climate dimension of ethical investment, depending on what your terminology is. And that's what I'll be talking about today in my brief opening comments and in terms of the participation on the panel. So I want to start my comments by making a quick observation that if you haven't noticed, over the last decade or so, there's been a quiet revolution taking place in the investor community, and it's a revolution in the definition of financial materiality. It's a revolution in the way that we think about what contributes to the bottom line and what are the dimensions of performance and return and risk when it comes to investment decision making. This has been sort of years in the making. It's gone through a number of different evolutions in terms of whether it does or doesn't meet directors' duties, whether it is or isn't part of your fiduciary duties, and whether it does or doesn't mean you should take a haircut or get extra premium. But nonetheless, it is one which I firmly believe has really, broached the surface and come into the spotlight in 2017, and that trend is only going to continue. And I think even in terms of the comments we heard this morning around the recognition of carbon risk as a financial risk is something that we've been working on for quite a number of years, and something which will continue to be extremely influential. Paris and the finalisation of the Paris Agreement was important for 2 reasons. One, because of the Paris Agreement itself provided us with the framework that the investor community really needed to begin to integrate carbon in a major way into investment decision making, and also because it provided the numbers which have been adopted by so many aspects of industry sectors across the board, and none more so than the property sector, it has to be said, and in particular in the proliferation of zero carbon fund or 2-degree aligned funds that we've seen, and I have to say with a little bit of parochial pride, led in no small part by Australian property companies as well. And so I think in that sense the Paris Agreement was hugely important in providing us with the language that we needed to understand the direction of travel for transition risk. But of course, launched in Paris as well was the Financial Stability Board Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, or the TCFD, for those of you playing TCFD bingo in the room. I understand I'm not the first person to say it today, and I'm pretty sure I won't be the last to say it over the course of the next few days, because it's just having such a phenomenal impact in the way that business thinks about climate change risk and opportunity. TCFD gives us a language and a framework for translating the environmental into the financial in a very hard way, but also in a consistent way across industry sectors. And yes, it's voluntary, but it's one of those voluntary initiatives that when everybody else has adopted, it's sort of not really voluntary anymore. Frameworks as well, and I think there's no doubt that we will see a continuing incredibly strong pressure from the investor community and also take up from industry around adoption of the TCFD as the language, the framework we use for translating the financial in the climate and the environmental dimension of ethical investment as an opportunity as well. And just to put it in context, so not that long ago, and some of you may have heard me say this quote before, I say it all the time because I think it's incredibly significant. Not that long ago, I was talking to someone who's a 20-year plus environmental campaigner, very deep green roots, would be fair to say, no friend to the finance sector, would be fair to say, who made the observation to me that these days they're not sure what will do more to address climate change, the Paris Agreement or the TCFD. And I think it goes very much to those trends that we've been talking about already today around industry getting on with the job in dealing with environmental issues. So I just want to just spend my last couple of minutes just talking quickly about, my last 35 seconds I should say, talking quickly about what the investment community is doing. And conveniently I can point you towards a website which sets out the framework of investor activity called the Investor Agenda. So if anybody wants to know what the investor agenda is around climate change, you can go to theinvestoragenda.org and find out. But effectively investors are doing four things. They're continuing to mobilise around policy, they're continuing to refine their approach to integration of environmental and ethical considerations into their investment processes from both a divestment and an investment perspective. They're increasing their own disclosure and demanding more disclosure from the companies that they invest in and other members of their own financial value chain, and also very actively engaged on corporate engagement. And this is the initiative I just want to close on in terms of my opening comments. And this is to point specifically to an indicative initiative that was launched in December last year at President Macron's One Planet Summit on December 12th, which is called the Climate Action 100 Plus. Climate Action 100 Plus is to some extent a culmination of what I started off talking about, which is years of thinking through the environmental and the financial and how to bring these themes together. It is effectively a 5-year project where investors come together in a shared corporate engagement program. It currently has around 280 global investors signed up to it, with 28 trillion US in assets under management behind them, including some of the biggest funds in the world and the biggest funds in Australia as well, I might add. They are asking the biggest emitting companies in the world, 100 plus additional regionally significant companies, so 100 plus, to do three things. One, to put in place internal governance processes around climate change, which comes back to what we were talking about in framing this session around board and director duty responsibilities. Two, to align their business strategy with the goals of the Paris Agreement to keep global warming to below 2 degrees. And three, to report on the TCFD. And if you're looking for an initiative which encapsulates the journey that the financial sector has been on, that's probably it. And if you don't believe what we're doing on a voluntary basis, then all you have to do is listen to what Jeff Summerhayes from APRA is telling the investment community he expects them to do, which is to be managing climate change as a foreseeable and actionable risk with real financial implications. And if investors think that their regulator thinks that they have a financial risk, even if they don't accept the need for action on climate change, they'll still be implementing a pretty effective response anyway. So I'm going to just pause there and open it up for questions. Just make one final comment that was in Narelle's opening comments as well, that too much in this case it's easy to focus on the risk, but I think the property sector has demonstrated amply that this is also all about the investment opportunity of the 21st century, which is the decarbonisation trend as well. So thanks very much. Thanks.
Thanks, Emma. Coming at the E in the ESG, and we're going to move into the S, so environment, social and governance. Professor David Kinley is the Chair in Human Rights at the Faculty of Law at the University of Sydney. He has a slight Scottish accent from 30 years ago. He spends his life on the boundaries of human rights issues. He's going to explain to us the issues we need to be talking about further. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Narelle. Thank you very much, everyone. It is actually on the boundaries. It's Northern Irish, so it's a bit Irish and a bit Scottish, but there we go. Last month, The Economist published an article on the state of the housing market in a country familiar to us all. The article was entitled, "Stop Speculating and Start Living." It described how the citizens of this country see property ownership as the biggest and best investment in their lives. Property prices, both residential and commercial, have risen exponentially in this country over the past 25 years. And its citizens believe that the government will never let the prices fall, at least not fall badly. But, the article goes on, concerns are rife. Concerns that homes are increasingly unaffordable, that the economy is too reliant on property, and that housing prices, having gone up and up, can someday crash. The country is China, and the words in the article's title, "Stop Speculating, Start Living," are a direct quote from the now leader for life, Xi Jinping. No country and no economy are immune from property speculation, and the price booms and busts they create. Houses are no longer just homes, and commercial buildings no longer just offices. They are assets, assets in which one invests, assets against which one can raise debt, assets that are traded for profit and assets that are taxed by governments. In short, property is a wealth-creating vehicle. None of this is necessarily bad or wrong. None of this is necessarily a threat to human rights, not even the human rights of those who do not own property, or even those who are literally homeless or jobless. But what is wrong, unfair, and a threat to individual human rights is the manner in which property has become financialized. From the point of view of the financier, built real estate is a commodity. The human characteristics of houses as private homes or commercial buildings as public spaces are largely irrelevant to the investors. And yet, houses are homes, homes that provide some of life's essentials, like shelter, safety, comfort, and privacy. And public buildings are places of work, play, learning, and healing. The built environment, in other words, constitutes an essential element in the fulfillment of so many of our basic human rights. Governments, corporations, investors, and we as individuals have a legal and social obligation to protect these rights for all in society. So when these rights are threatened by financial or economic crises, by austerity measures, by inflated or indeed deflated property prices, and by political incompetence, then these obligations are failed. Today, there is more than enough global wealth to go around, but poverty still persists, even in rich countries. And the wealth inequality gap is widening in all countries, including the poorest. There are many reasons, of course, for this injustice, but one of them is the malign influence of the financialization of everything, including and maybe especially property. We have bred cultures of greed and avarice and wealth worship in our societies at large and inside the financial sector in particular. Finance has cultivated a Darwinian ethic of devil-may-care competition in the pursuit of financial gain, of excessive risk-taking, of entitlement to the biggest slice of the financial pie, and of indifference to the wider consequences of its actions. The financial sector's dismissive and manipulative attitude towards the rule of law is especially a serious problem. The parades of bank prosecutions in the US and the UK, and the litany of bad and illegal bank behaviour here in Australia, prompting the Banking Royal Commission, are pitiful and damning. So the responsibilities beyond the boardroom of those in banking, insurance, and financial advisory services are to shed the sense of entitlement, shed the claims of exceptionalism, and shed their disrespect for the rule of law. Financial institutions have a duty to recognize their debt to society. Banks are, after all, the servants, not the masters of society. And this means that they behave in ways that not only profit themselves and their shareholders, but also fairly serve their clients, their customers, and everyone else impacted by their actions. Now, they could begin this reform by actively recognizing the wider contexts in which property exists, beyond property being merely another asset class. Rooting out corrupt practices and unethical behavior in property-related finance would be a good start. And in this, we in society could help them by curbing our own greed and avarice, and thereby stop legitimizing the exaggeration of those very same characteristics in our bankers, in our businesses, and in our political leaders. So, we all need to stop speculating and start living. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. We'll have more discussion around that very interesting take on speculation. Our third speaker is Heri Cho. She's based in Singapore. She's the Director and Head of Sustainable Finance Asia for ING Bank. Welcome, Heri.
Even lower. Good morning, everyone. I'll start off by saying I hope one day soon my role will not exist. being head of sustainable finance, well, it shouldn't exist because it should be embedded into every single process that a financier looks at, including banks. And that brings to the point that we're all in transition today, including the financial institutions and the building industry, the energy industry, every single industry you're looking at, we're all going towards one direction. And what that means is for financiers like us, we must embed environmental, social, and governance aspects into the decisions that we make. And not doing something is not an option today, as we all agree, but not funding something is not enough either. So for example, we say, ING as a bank, it's a Dutch heritage institution with presence in 40 countries, including Australia. But we came out with probably one of the harshest policies around coal, saying we're not going to finance anything to do with coal anymore. But that's not enough, because then if we just simply not finance that and pass the ball to others, then the funding is going to continue. So the strategy that we take is helping the transition and working in partnership with our clients, whether that be in the real estate community or financial institutions, other financial institutions, and other sectors too. And that also means setting specific targets, quantitative targets. So for us, for example, we've just announced the 2017 results. There's about 20 billion euros of what we call responsible finance on our balance sheet, and about 9.3 billion of that is what we call climate-friendly buildings, or low-carbon buildings. And we look to double that by 2022, with 2017 as the base. And the very specific targets that's going to be set for every single country is going to come into effect in second half of this year. Within real estate, by 2023, we will only be investing in so-called green buildings. The definition of green buildings will differ depending on which country you look at. But for example, in Netherlands, there's also local benchmarks there. In Australia already, increasingly, we're only looking at, for example, commercial property that has neighbors rating of 4.5 and above. And that does not mean actually we're not going to look at ones who have lesser than that. It means that we're going to concretely work with them to say, what is your strategy to be, for example, carbon neutral by 2025? And then, having come up with a plan, we'll look to finance and help them reach that goal. So, financing of assets that's sustainable, it's one way to make a change. But how do you influence corporate strategy? Well, I've already explained how a financier like us are planning to do it. But how do you impact the companies that we actually put our money towards and strengthen those stakeholder relationships at the same time? Last year, we had launched quite an innovative product in the loan market, and they are it's called a sustainability improvement loan, and that's very much so in the spirit of transition. And what it does is we utilized the sustainability rating companies like MSCI ESG. Within real estate, GRESB is one of the market leaders, and we like those very much. Sustainalytics, for example, as well. And so we looked at the company's rating as it stands, and we set certain KPIs around environmental, social, and governance aspects, and said if you hit these targets, then we will reward you by decreasing the price at which we give you capital by way of a loan. What was most inspiring about these loans is that the conversation within the companies completely changes. So the driving of the ESG and sustainability agenda it's usually done by, let's say, sustainability GM. But we always make sure the room that where we have these conversations has the CFO or head of treasury at the same time. So suddenly, before you know it, the CFO and the finance function has also become a stakeholder in the strategy that the company wants to make. And so, looking at companies who actually hit those targets is also very inspiring to see, and it will essentially become a starting point in sustainable finance journey, and in partnership together, you move forward to next steps. One final remark I'll make is innovation should not be ignored. So for example, we've also innovated on what's called a sustainability app for the real estate sector, which already has 25,000 buildings signed on in the Netherlands, for example. And you can key in the information of the building, and that tells you what equivalent of energy label or sustainability label that is, and what improvements or retrofitting you can make in order to take that to higher labels. What's the payback period, what is the investment that you need to make, etc. And we're also looking to see how we can bring this to this part of the world too, including Australia. So everything that I'm talking about clearly contributes towards energizing of communities, because every single impact within corporations, you're going to be inspired to be working in a company that has this at the focus, and ultimately everything that gets invested in this way would be healthy and sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. I wanted to pick up, we'll be coming to questions, so if you can text us the questions, and then we'll be taking questions from the floor. I just wanted to pick up on your point that by 2023, you're only going to be investing in green buildings. Is there any suggestion of a shortage of investment opportunities? And conversely, what might that leave on the table for the laggards? What's your rough estimate of the size of what might be people that don't meet that hurdle?
Hello? I wouldn't have a stats, Neural, sorry, on top of my head, but I think it's definitely going to be a journey depending on which jurisdiction and which country you're in. I mean, for example, in Netherlands, where we already rolled this out, for example, the sustainability app, that there's increasing numbers of buildings owners who are wanting to be on this journey. I think large corporates are increasingly embracing this thought, and every single thing that they do, from design, from design all the way to operations, it gets embedded, but also looking at the SMEs, it's harder from cost perspective, as well as operations, to focus on sustainability throughout. So I think increasing the awareness in that segment of the market, it's also very important. Yeah.
And in order to drive the conversation around ethical investment beyond the boardroom, first of all, we have to change the conversation in the boardroom. I was interested in your observation about the CFOs and the finance people really getting this. To what degree is that shifting the conversation in management, and then really encouraging boards to look at the opportunities as well as the risks on this?
Where that kind of ESG embracement happens the best is when the change is already there from the very top. So either the founder, pressure from the shareholders, or at the CEO level. So they are passionate believers already that the company needs to go that way. But typically they tend to be CEOs of large companies that operates in dozens of countries. So it's really looking at how do you implement that. And that's when it starts to go down to the COO and CFO levels. And the CFOs, for example, are already aware that the company wants to go in that direction, but they didn't really know how they can be part of that. And so the moment you start to look at, let's say, sustainable instruments or products as a start, right, into eventually mainstream integration, that's when they also get excited and want to drive the process internally, not only in the boardroom, but into the rest of the organization.
Emma, what's your sense now of the appetite, and to what degree? Well, we're seeing institutional investors driving this, but that greater awareness by investors more generally.
Yeah, I mean, I also wanted to comment on the observation made that I heard a fantastic description a number of years ago. I think this was from Shell, but I'm not sure. So don't quote me necessarily specifically attributing it to Shell, but where they described it as the clay layer. So boards who have obligations to look slightly longer term understand the value of looking at sustainability issues and dimensions to performance. Staff with operational responsibility and employees of companies, and particularly employees starting in on the workforce, really get the value of working for a company which is managing it. But it's the CEO, CFO level, which is the clay layer, where they're entirely incentivized around getting a jump on their colleagues, and that's almost entirely based on financial remuneration targets and KPIs. So it's the clay layer which is now in the pressure sandwich, shall we say?
The clay layer in the
clay
pressure
layer
sandwich.
in the pressure sandwich,
Yeah.
just to really get your mind boggling with that mental picture. But also, I mean, I don't want to overstate the level of commitment in the boardroom either. There's a lot of boards who are talking sustainability, but what we're really looking for through initiatives such as the TCFD, and this is where the investor pressure is coming in, is show us the money. Show us that you don't just believe in climate change and accept the science of climate change, but show us your capital expenditure towards carbon-intensive activities, or show us your actual R&D towards low-carbon innovation and technology solutions. Show us how you're integrating climate resilience considerations into your mortgage book. Show us how you're, explicitly publishing targets on doubling your exposure to one of the big low carbon opportunities, which is green buildings in the built environment. So, I mean, that's kind of how we're seeing the conversation now evolving from it being beyond the boardroom and into the management level. I think is one of the key trends that we are definitely going to see more of this year and for the next few years in particular.
I'll pick up, if I have time, on in terms of the non-financial incentives in terms of those decisions. But I wanted to pick up on this a question, which is the proportion of the investor universe that is targeting ESG type investments. Have you got some scope on that?
No, I don't have stats off the top of my head, but one thing
26 trillion in terms of the broader
the corporate engagement
change,
side of things. Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that the one of the challenges that the institutional investor community has is how do you put a dollar figure on low carbon investment? Because and this is something that we're grappling with right now, because often for my constituency, institutional investors, the most common approach is a whole of portfolio decarbonisation approach. So what's, if you look at what the metrics are for the asset owners and asset managers in the TCFD, which is, the Bible of how to think about these things, it's portfolio level emissions intensity. And that's the response that a lot of investors themselves are taking. What's my total spread of investments? Where are the worst? Where are the emerging opportunities? How do I tilt or move across the whole portfolio and adjust over time and improve my expected financial performance? And also, where do I target those low carbon opportunities? And that becomes harder question around definition. One quick comment I would make is that much is made of the green bond growth, and there's no doubt that it's one of the biggest growing areas. So green fixed income and real estate, the two biggest asset classes for low carbon investment. But even in the green bond universe, aiming for 1 trillion in green bonds by 2020, it's still a fraction of global green bond issuance. But there's no doubt it's growing at an exponential rate, but still quite a small percentage in terms of technically labelled green, 100% deep green investment. But it's a difficult question to answer necessarily.
Yeah, if I may add to that, I was just in London, 3 weeks ago, talking to institutional investors, and one of them actually said to me, where did green bonds come from? Like, I certainly don't want them, and my counterparts that I speak to don't want green bonds. And the reason why is because it's only looking at the environment, right? It makes no sense to pigeonhole an investment with environmental factors taken into account only. So a lot of the institutional investors, from thematic perspective, not only want green, or resource friendly investments, but also ones that touch upon social too. But on a broader scale, there's these so-called thematic investors who specifically have pockets of capital that goes towards green. Is a small proportion over the overall market. There's many different approaches that investors take when they look at embedding ESG into their strategies. So, for example, looking at best in class. I had mentioned of the sustainability ratings, which are funded by investors, by the way, subscription only, funded by investors. And for example, within one sector, they'd look at the top 30% of best in class only. or they would look for companies that has ESG embedded into the strategy of the company. Whilst green bond has been taking the headlines, it's growing exponentially, etc., but it's still a small subset of the overall ESG investment criteria.
So green and blue and yellow and a whole bunch of other colours that incorporate the fabric of the impact on society.
Could I just say something? I think the answer to this question comes down to definition and to measuring performance, the point that Emma was making. And indeed it leads to what you said right at the beginning, and that is you think you're an ethical investor, but maybe it turns out you're not. I've had the same...
Well, I found out I wasn't.
Yeah,
and I was just in ordinary super.
And I've had the same experience with looking at my own super. I mean, a lot of funds are very crude in what they consider to be the ethical sieve that they put their funds through. They create them, and so they're putting you, as it were, at the behest of the creators of these funds. And if it's a thin sieve, you get rid of gambling, you get rid of smoking, and you get rid of guns, there's a lot else that's problematic in all of that. So I do agree that I think you can't separate the S and G from the E. All three are likely to be together. But how it's going to be defined and then how you measure the performance of that meeting the ESG targets is something that we're way, way behind yet. I think environment, and I think that's one of the reasons why you have green bonds, is ahead of human rights. Human rights is 20 years behind because it's so difficult at the moment to be able to quantify and measure. But, and that may be the reason why there's a focus on green bonds. But even there, I still think that it's not a perfect measure by any means, and so it does make it very difficult to answer the question that the texter asked.
The principles of responsible investment do pick up those three elements. David, I wanted to, the other uncomfortable conversation we're starting to have, and it's been pleasing to see a large number of Australian companies participating in this, is with the introduction of the Modern Slavery Act. From your perspective, how will that change how an organisation thinks of its supply chain and the kind of unintended consequences of its doing business?
Well, I think actually the consequences are going to be very much intended. From what you can see from what the government has produced, and the recommendations of the committee are to have something rather similar to the UK Modern Slavery Act. And I think in respect of your industry, there's been some very interesting moves there. The Chartered Institute of Building in the United Kingdom has produced 2 papers in the last 2 years on modern slavery. They really take this thing seriously. And they see the potential problems of their big builders who have got installations and operations overseas, but also ones that are purely working within Britain, but are importing stuff that may be subject to a supply chain that has got slavery in it. It's a big, as you probably know, the British model is above 36 million sterling turnover. It's likely to be something similar here. But when you look at what the Chartered Institute has done, I think from a human rights professor's point of view, it's very sensible. It's smart. It says, don't try and do everything at once. First of all, map out your supply chain, and I think a lot of people haven't fully mapped out their supply chain yet. Then do the due diligence, find where there are problems, admit to them, use it as a sort of mea culpa rather than trying to hide. Don't follow the Nixonian white presidential
Long nothing
problems.
to see here, yes.
Be much more open. This is not your industry, but I remember years ago when I was starting out in this area in the early 2000s, Gap had a social responsibility report in which they said we found real problems down our supply chain at a time when everyone thought this was madness because they'd be torn apart by the hippie open-toed sandal-wearing community of human rights advocates like me.
But they weren't quite a few in our audience.
But they weren't quite the reverse. People applauded them and they said we'll seek to try and repair this. And that's the message, really the central message behind the modern slavery legislation, both here and the UK. It's transparency and putting it on the companies to open up their supply chains and then try and deal with it. And that's the right way. That's the way it should be.
Andrew Forrest has talked about the truths they found at Fortescue Metal, for example, and trying to come to grips with that in terms of and then doing the right things. We've got a question. There's one here. If you could, Jeff.
Morricon. A lot of your discussion has been about investing at an institutional level. Now, there's lots of people in the room who invest for their own super and things like that, and some people invest in properties. They buy, apartments and so on. At the moment, there's no declaration around what the performance of different building types, houses, are going to be around their environmental performance, their energy performance. What does the panel think about what kind of legislation or information should be provided by large property companies to investors around the performance of the buildings that they're going to invest in?
Thanks, Jeff. I'd like to take that.
So one of the interesting things we've seen in Australia is the effect of mandatory disclosure provisions on activity. So at the point of sale or the point of tenancy, actually having to disclose the performance of the building, I think has had a very real and tangible effect on understanding and driving improved outcomes from an environmental perspective. At the residential level, it's been much harder. Even where there has been disclosure frameworks, they tend to be state-based and inconsistent. And I think I'm commenting here with two hats on, from previous life in a bank and then also from an institutional investor perspective. From previous life in a bank, banks were always looking at ways that they could, because the mortgage lending market is so competitive, we're always looking at ways they could create a green home loan product that would actually attract customers and promote improved environmental outcomes at the residential level. And it was actually incredibly hard because of the commoditised nature of product delivery to do that. So I think there's huge scope to do some sort of national framework for proving up the environmental performance of the assets. Where you are seeing it is in property developers with new residential developments are selling them on the basis of their environmental performance and capacity, and it's both in terms of insulation, energy efficiency, solar panels on the roof, and battery storage ready residential, and with smart technology built in to help you monitor it on an ongoing basis. I mean, I think that's where you're seeing that leading edge progress actually happening, which is not a direct answer to the question, but I think maybe talks to a couple of the issues that I think you might have had in mind.
We've been given the time's up here. I want to finish with this last question from you, which is, there's a neuroscience, a kind of how our brains work issue in here. So how do we switch the conversation in the boardroom from the risks to the opportunities? And Nicholas Stern described it as the biggest opportunity in the 21st century. What language should leaders be using?
Maybe I can use ING as an example. So we have two different teams that looks at sustainability, rather three even actually. There's a team that specifically looks at ING's own footprint, and that looks at our own energy consumption in our business. There's a team that looks at environmental and social risk mitigation. So that's the team on behalf of the bank that reports into the risk function and says, all the we've checked on all these fronts from transaction and from client perspective. Then there's a sustainable finance team, which is my team, and we are all about opportunities. And some of the data that backs up the reason why a team was created is in the languages of, for example, scenario planning for climate change in the future. So numbers tell us that investing in sustainable investments is good business, and we're already proving that in what we invest in, and it's going to be increasingly better business. So, a team like mine being set up is not that frequent in the market in the global scheme of things. But, I can say that definitely every single proof point that we make in every deal closed is a proof point and gets the board excited. And they're the ones then who are harsher than everyone else on the ground to say, okay, you know what, coal policy has to be absolutely ironclad. So they were the ones who were driving us away from negative business and more towards positive business, and trying to give more resources to make that happen. So, and that's number one. And secondly, the moment you combine discussions around innovation, to sustainable development. What I mean by that is I think in every single company there's so much focus on data, usage of technology, artificial intelligence, and what that means to our industries and business. Now, where is the demand for this coming from? It's actually coming in the context of the SDGs and the sustainable development. Connectivity is what sustainable development is about. You know, connected infrastructure, connected buildings, etc. So the moment that link gets made in the boardroom and at every single level below that, that's when a more integrated viewpoint from opportunity perspective comes into crystallization.
Thanks, Harry. Quick last comment.
Yeah, very quick comment. I would just say, talk about it in terms of return. Talk about it in terms of competition, as in what are your peers doing, and then talk about it in terms of fear of getting it wrong. If you fail to act and you end up being named and shamed by esteemed professionals like David
And
for
APRA.
and APRA. So I would definitely say it's about return, it's about competition, and it's about reputational risk.
Yeah, the legal. David, last quick comment.
Turning perceived risks and threats into opportunities. Somebody said this morning at breakfast, believe in the ingenuity of humankind. And indeed, I would say, despite what I said at the lectern, believe in the angel within humankind as well. One of the examples that came out of Britain's experiment with the Modern Slavery Act, when the commissioner came out here, the British commissioner came out here, he talked about the relationship he had with Co-op, it's a sort of like Aldi type supermarket in Britain, and he said they were really resistant, but when he started to talk to them, they became real converts. In fact, they saw it as an opportunity, to give them a competitive advantage. Surely that shows the ingenuity of business.
We have ingenuity amongst us in great spades. Please put your hands together and thank Emma Hurd, David McKinley and Harry Cho. And a final observation, ask the question of your super fund. You'll be surprised at the answer. Thank you very much. And
well, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Narelle, Harry, David and Emma again. That was a very big picture session indeed, and some sizable gauntlets thrown down to us therein, so we will keep those in mind as we go through the course of the next day and a half. Please thank them once more. Come on, make it 3 times. Why not? They deserve it. And thanks again to major sponsor Liberty One Steel. And now, our next session is sponsored by associate sponsor Arup. And before we commence, we've got a short video featuring Joan Coe, who's Associate Environment and Resources and Sustainability Leader for Victoria and South Australia at Arup, discussing what actions the sustainability industry needs to take to energise communities.
I'd really, really like to see our cities tackle the circular economy in a really fundamental way. We've got crises all over the place. People wanting roads that'll only be used at their peak capacity, trains the same. We have China, they've banned recyclables from Australia. So it's really time to look at the circular economy in a meaningful way. And that means using all our assets, all our built environment assets, our people and our services to the maximum, to their optimal capacity. I think what that will mean is that our cities will work around the clock. So the people who like waking up early, the people who like working at night time, they'll be using the city and it'll just hum 24 hours.
Thank you, Arup, and I'm now delighted to introduce the next session, Smart Cities Beyond the Buzzword. The superb Adam Beck, Executive Director, Smart Cities Council Australia New Zealand, needs no introduction. Please warmly welcome him.
Thank you, Michael. Michael, thank you for that introduction. Oh, that's a terrible photo. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome everyone. I hope you're enjoying day one of Green Cities. I'd like to start by thanking Arup, our session sponsor for today. We don't have a lot of time with you, but we want to dig into a very interesting, exciting, topical sort of item, which is smart cities. And we've labelled this session Beyond the Buzzword. We're going to unpack that a little bit. I'd like you to sort of queue up your questions, regardless of how provocative they are. We would like to get a diversity of sort of interests and responses through the tweets and the SMS and all those lovely sort of platforms that get us those questions. And to help me in unpacking this idea, I'd like to sort of introduce a stellar panel that we have. It's a little bit rigged, a lot of the believers, but I want to make sure that we sort of unpack some very interesting issues. With that, I'd like to start with my first panellist, Adam Fennessy, partner with EY here. Adam, there he is, he appears. Next, joining me on the panel is Meredith Hodgman from Austrade, Senior Trade Advisor in Future Cities. Followed by Meredith is Merrick Spain, who is the Smart Cities lead for Telstra, who are also a sponsor of Green Cities. And of course, last but not least, Angus Taylor, our new Minister for Law Enforcement and Cyber Security. Thank you, panellists. I just want to quickly start by saying that Smart Cities Beyond the Buzzword is sort of a topic that I've been sharing with the panel. We've got a few questions that we're going to unpack, but I'm starting with a soundbite from each of you. Literally a soundbite. You've got 30 seconds. I'm going to start with you, Adam. Smart cities a pipe dream, is it?
It's not a pipe dream, it is coming our way, it's here, and to me it's great to start at the community level, street, building, precinct, and that, so if we bring in community and partnerships, we'll get somewhere.
Okay, thank you. Meredith?
No, Adam, smart cities are not a pipe dream. Austrade works with world-leading Australian firms every single day who offer niche technologies for urban efficiencies and who are, in fact, in high demand internationally and already embedded in projects all around the world.
Okay. Merrick?
No surprises, agree with the previous two panellists. All our research over the last 5 years is outlining the fact that digital aspirations of people, businesses and other stakeholders are rising. And, smart cities is about the transformation of human experience in the context of people in place. And so cities and communities are the lens through which people's expectations and aspirations are rising.
Okay.
Thanks for having me, Adam.
Well, pleasure. I didn't do much.
Look, no, I don't think it is a pipe dream. And in my previous role, we launched the Smart Cities and Suburbs program, first round of that, where I saw for real this is happening. The fundamental question is how do we accelerate it and realise it here in Australia? And working through the barriers and how we knock them down, I think that's the really big question.
Yeah, okay. Austrade took a delegation to Barcelona in November last year. We had about 28 to be precise. Stakeholders from all walks of life. You were both on that delegation. It's where the world goes to meet on smart cities. Thousands of exhibitors, a number of conference sessions. It's the first time sort of a real contingency from Australia has gone over to mix with the rest of the world. It was interesting. We often think that we've got a lot to learn from elsewhere in the world, and I think we do, but I was quite surprised that I think we're kind of doing quite well here. I want to start with you, Meredith. We're not starting at zero, are we? We've kind of been tinkering around with this for quite some time.
True. In discrete pockets, I would say we have started to excel, and it is coming together as a bit of a narrative. Austrade talks a lot about comparative advantage because we benchmark projects that are happening around the world, me personally, as they relate to cities, but we see great expertise developing in particularly around prop tech, GIS, clean tech, carbon adaptation more broadly, and simulation technologies and augmented reality specifically for the built environment. So, there's a lot of spectrum across the transport, energy, civil services, environment and critical infrastructure spaces, but these areas we genuinely have great competitive advantage in, and the world is looking to us to learn how to apply that.
Yeah, okay. Question for Merrick, Adam. It's often been viewed as a tech agenda, a tech-driven agenda. I think that was part of the problem and the miscommunication for the first decade of the Smart Cities agenda. End of pipe, widgets, devices, that's all great. Adam, when we're seeing the likes of the Big Four starting to employ talent like yourself, this is really moving further upstream, isn't it? This is no longer a tech agenda. This is another agenda, right?
Yep, I agree, Adam. It's very much moving away in its focus from tech, and so I'm now the Future Cities lead for EY for Oceania, the EY global approach is, instead of going straight into the tech and the digital, of the 3 areas of focus, that comes third. So first it's about community, then it's about the partnerships or the ecosystems within a city, and then it's about the digital. Digital is an incredible enabler, but community has got to come first. Before I joined EY, I was with the Victorian government, and before that the Commonwealth government, working in planning water, energy, communities, as well as infrastructure. And I think where Australian cities, 2 areas where we have a great comparative advantage is we have been renowned for years about our livability. We don't have to repeat about Melbourne's world's most livable city. So when I've gone overseas in the past, it's what were the systems that you set up to keep your clean air, your clean water, and so on. The other opportunity we have is while we have many layers of government, we have really worked hard at how does the state and cities work with the Commonwealth. The City Deals is a great example of really bringing together our three levels of government and getting in there and investing. And I know from talking to the Minister before, you could endlessly try to define a smart city or a green city. I think it's better to get in there, talk to community, and learn by investing. The last point I'll make is at EY, we've got a market research arm, EY Sweeney. So for Melbourne and Sydney, we started out by talking to 1,000 people in each of those cities and said to them, what is important to you? And not surprisingly, it's security, open space, ease of getting around. So if we go back to people and say, you know, what makes Hobart a great city, or Melbourne or Geraldton or, you know, Geelong, that's a great place to start. So I think it has moved from beyond the tech to the people, and I do think we've got to learn by doing and keep pushing these investments and evaluating them.
Yeah, okay, thanks for that. Merrick, I'm going to throw to you. I'm going to make a statement. I want you to respond, okay? Might be a bit provocative, but particularly with this audience, the city builders, the city shapers, the folks that are represented in this room here, haven't necessarily been at the smart cities table because it's sort of been wrestled out by the technologists. What are you seeing in terms of this transition and pivot, or perceived or real transition or pivot into smart cities being more of a city-making agenda? What are you seeing as a technologist?
Yeah, Adam, I'd agree. I think until about 12, maybe 15 months ago, largely speaking, the built form environment was not at the table, and I think that's a great pity. The last year and a little bit has seen a dramatic change in that. For example, I was down in Canberra a week before last, presenting at an event anybody from Canberra would know in Telstra Tower, the big tower on the top of the hill, and it was mostly the built form, and it was plumbers, electricians. Right? So when people like that are starting to say, hey, what is this smart cities thing? This sounds like, looks like, smells like something that's actually kind of what I do and what I need to be thinking about, then that's really encouraging. And I think, you know, we were talking before the panel, and I think that we can really, now that the built form environment is at the table, we can really get together and have some early, deep, meaningful conversations about the things that we can do to really get some traction going.
Yeah, okay. I think to also reinforce your comments there, Angus, you know, you were overseeing the Smart Cities and Suburbs program, $50 million, which has been an amazing catalyst for local government, for the private sector, and partnerships forming around that. When you look at the 50 projects that got awarded late last year, there was a bit of everything in there, wasn't there, in terms of livability solutions and looking at technology as a driver. From a policy-making perspective, 271 applications to start with. You know, money can only go so far. But did that surprise you, the response? What were you thinking?
No, I think it's still early stage. So you've got to take an approach which is let 1,000 flowers bloom, because you are at that very early stage. It's still reasonably exploratory, and so we picked a small number of cities where we're doing an integrated set of projects, and a lot of cities where we're doing 1 or 2 projects. And I think that was a good way to get started. In contrast to, say, the US that just picked 1 city and did the whole thing. I think that's very high risk. But look, the whole point about tech, I couldn't agree more. There's tech problems to solve. I mean, cyber is a big problem to solve, the IoT stuff, the networks, how they're all going to work. But I still think the biggest problem to solve is how we connect the data that we're collecting, the technology, to the problem we're trying to solve. And the people who can do that, having more of those people, to me, is the key to this. As we get more problem solvers who can take data, analyse it, and turn it into a solution to a problem, then that's when we'll get a lead. And that's the piece of the puzzle that I think we have to focus on more than anything.
Yeah, excellent. We've got 22 minutes left. I want to leave about 10 to 12 minutes for questions. And I'd like to see those coming through. I'll get to those in a moment. I've got sort of like a killer question that I'm going to ask each of my panellists to answer. So you've reinforced that this smart cities thing is real. It's not a pipe dream. It's well beyond a buzzword. It's happening. We're investing at all levels and sectors. So we think we're doing okay. It's still early days. The question I have of each of you is, what is that key action for industry, government? You can address it separately or together. What's that key action that's going to not only cement ourselves as a sort of a nation that's institutionalising technology and data for good? How do we get up there to be a global leader? You know, the poster childs of Barcelona and Amsterdam have been around for a long time. It's just in their DNA now. The US is coming through, India's 100 Smart Cities program. Canada late last year launched their national program. New Zealand's kind of been and gone at the moment. We're going through ours. We have our national plan at the moment. What's going to take us to that leadership position? Because I would imagine we would ultimately want to be a net exporter of talent, of technology and solutions, as opposed to sort of a taker. Adam, how would you respond to sort of that question of, you know, what's going to get us to that global leadership position?
I think that keeping the community as part of the process is going to help us succeed. Any good big company knows its customers and knows that its success is driven by listening to its customers. So I think, how are we connecting with our citizens? And to go back to my earlier comment, a big city like Melbourne or Sydney, we were thinking about, what does it look like for Fisherman's Bend as that huge new precinct gets redeveloped? What might it look like for Barangaroo? And you can apply that to pretty much every capital city in Australia. And secondly, what does that look like for booming regional cities like Geelong or Newcastle? So I think that bringing that along, and there are some great technologies that also allow for that citizen engagement. The last example I'll use along this theme is the City of Melbourne many years ago ran a citizens' jury to allocate $20 million of its budget. Infrastructure Victoria, that I was on the board of for the last couple of years, ran 2 citizens' juries for the Victorian 30-year infrastructure plan. Now, I'm not saying it's about citizens' juries, but it's about thinking of new and evolved ways of connecting with people. Nearly everyone's got a smartphone, so how are we tapping into the voices of our people through both data collection but also activating their voices, so that globally we're known for having these incredible cities that our citizens have really driven along with the technology.
Yeah, okay, thanks for that. Meredith, you're next up, but I'm going to get this question on the bottom to you straight away. Where is Australia positioned compared to other countries in terms of smart cities?
It's a great question. It's one of my favourites. I think we're very well positioned to catch the lessons learnt that have been implemented and developed across the established markets of America and Europe. We have the ability to learn from the mistakes that they made and that they have documented and they've talked about and that they've interrogated. And as the sector develops quite rapidly here, we can then implement that properly into the way that we are designing our cities, the way that we are integrating the land use and the transport into the reality of the citizen engagement for the future. So what we do see, or the projects that we do have here, is actually much more mature and finessed projects that are starting on the first phase, if you will. So Australian smart cities have a starting point of Smart Cities version 2 is the short answer.
Okay, thank you for that. So now the question, that key action to take Australia into that global leadership position for industry, government, combine them, separate them, up to you.
Sure. After listening to Adam talk, it's amazing detail and worth just taking a step back and remembering, you know, Austrade really comes at this from a global perspective. So some big concepts in there for you, instead of the granular detail that Adam can really apply. We are very proud about talking about Australia's strengths internationally, and we do it all the time, but it does come to my mind that domestically here at home, we are often very quick to criticise ourselves. Critique is a valuable part of the process, there's no doubt about that, and certainly within the built environment, that's something that's ingrained within the professionalism of this sector, and it's something that we should be proud of, because that is the pursuit of best practice. And that pursuit of best practice is actually what leads our reputation internationally. It's what's making us develop and emerge as a leader in this space. So what industry could do to really catalyse this is to not just critique our weaknesses, but to interrogate our strengths, to look to the regions, the communities and our neighbours to consider what we are really good at before we look for what we think we're missing. And only then, when we are having conversations with leaders across the board, when the technologists are speaking to the built environment sector, and when we are actually having those meaningful localised conversations, will we be able to address the technical questions like interoperability and the standards that are required to effect real civic change on the ground.
Okay, thank you. Merrick, you know what the question is?
I do, thank you, Adam. I think we need to start focusing on building a culture around data. As I travel around, one of the things that strikes me is that everyone's using the word data. I think everybody here probably used the word data about 100-fold more times in the last 24 months than in the 20 years before that. But who's really making decisions based on that data? And when you think through the dynamics of things like, the fact that the value of data grows exponentially, the more people are contributing their data, and that goes right from federal and state government, local government, goes to corporates and industry, goes to, the fish and chip shop on the corner, goes to Joe and Jane Citizen. We're just a long way away from what we need to build foundationally to start working towards a national culture that understands how we need to use data to make decisions. Because ultimately, we can install connected widgets, and I say this as the tech guy on the panel, but I'm also the tech guy that stands in front of people and has a slide that has the word love on it, so I kind of feel qualified to say this. Once we get beyond the immediate level of value that you can extract from installing that connected widget, what are you left with? What are you left with unless you take steps beyond that, where you start looking at not only the data that you're getting from that connected device, but you're also looking at cross-pollinating that data with data from other devices, from pre-existing data that various stakeholders in a community might have, to deliver higher levels of value and extract higher levels of value. So I think data is my answer.
Okay, thank you. Angus?
Yeah, I think we're well positioned because it's still very early days to be a leader. But to me, there's two really critical things that we've got to get right. Number one is governance, and this is how you get every level of government, all three, federal, state, local, as well as the private sector, tech service providers and others, to align around projects. And that governance is hard, but because it's hard, it's also something that if you get it right, you can have huge impact. So governance is crucial, and I'm talking about governance down at the local level. At the national level, that's important, but it's at the local level you need it most. The second is talent. And, you do not win in any sector without talent in this era. To me, the tech talent's important, but the talent that we need most is that problem-solving data, science, data analysis talent, the people who can take the data and solve a problem. I was driving this morning, I got a 2-hour drive to get to the airport, and I'm sitting there saying, if someone could actually tell me on this day of the week, outside of school holidays when it's raining, which it was, what my worst case scenario is for how long it takes for me to get to the airport, maybe I could have got another half hour of sleep. But there's no analysis. I know Google.
No, there is an app. Didn't you tell me there was an app for that? It wakes you up early because it's done the analysis. I'm sure. There's an app for it.
But the data's there, right?
Yeah.
The data is there. Yeah. No one has solved the problem. And this is, I could give you 20 problems like that. Where I know the data's there. Google's got the data. Lots of others have got the data. But no one has solved the problem.
Yeah. I go so far as saying data's good, but who wants good? Unless we convert it into intelligence, it's almost verging on irrelevance. While you've got the mic, this is fairly in your ball court. The question is, in the context of interconnection of data and data gathering, how are adequate protections of privacy balanced with leverage advantages of both government and
This is a great question, and when I talk about the barriers, this is one of the barriers. So whoever asked it, well done. And now that I've got cybersecurity, I'm very focused on it. As we move to more and more devices out there, people are talking about 75 billion devices by 2025 around the world. That's about 10 devices for every human being. It's extraordinary. Whether even we get to half of that, it's enormous. And I tell you what, there's backdoors there for every crim and hostile government who wants to take out our infrastructure and take your identity. So this is a really, really big deal. We're doing a couple of things at the government level already, and we'll have to do more. We're working on more. Number one is you own your data. Productivity Commission came out with a very simple but profound report a little while back. Simple, I say, it was about 500 pages. And it said customers should own their data. That has to be the governing principle. And then secondly, we've got to get the cybersecurity around that right. And that is absolutely crucial.
Sorry, can I ask the time clock gods to quickly... I've got no idea how much time we've got left here. 10 minutes, great, we've got plenty of time. I'm going to pick up on that. I penned an article in the Fifth Estate last week that got some interesting reception. There's been a lot of chatter around Sidewalk Labs building out the project in Toronto, Bill Gates getting a huge chunk of land in the middle of the US and building a smart city, and an undertone of, this is the tech companies wanting to take everything that we've got, and it's Facebook gone crazy, and that's it, I want to opt out. Merrick, I was going to ask the question, when is Telstra going to get into the city building game, but I won't. But talk to me about your approach and how you view this idea of security and privacy. I totally agree with you, Angus. Privacy and security is the Achilles heel of the smart cities movement. Whether it's real or perceived, it's the Achilles heel. And of course, the other major Achilles heel is, or the barrier is procurement, of course. It eats innovation for breakfast, as Tim Williams says. Your view on this privacy, security, level of concern, your ability to hose that down, where are you at?
I think it's an important question because fundamentally it's about trust. Trust is the currency, right? That's what we've got to deal in. I think there's a common misconception that privacy is kind of about secrecy, which it's not. Privacy is fundamentally about accountability, and it's about setting up an exchange of value with consumers. At the end of the day, it's okay to say to people, we want to use this data to do this, but there's got to be a get-give. There's got to be a clear, concise message about the value you're going to add to their everyday life. How many minutes is it going to take me to get to the airport so I can sleep in another 30 minutes? And if somebody could say to you, well, I need your data to help you with that, and if they had the fundamental underlying initial trust that, hey, this is an organisation that has credibility that I trust to be able to handle that data, it's a no-brainer. Okay.
Have we got any old school questions via microphone that people want to ask? Is that what you were saying before? Oh, I didn't know what you were doing. You were going, you got to be clearer. Rom, have we got a mic? Yeah. You don't need a mic really, do you? Well, none of us do.
This is maybe a Dorothy Dixon for the Minister. Adam and I sat on your city's task group last year, and you'll be missed, so thank you for all the work you did. But how do we measure the progress and performance of our cities, and what's the federal government doing about it?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And of course, we've got our performance framework, which we published towards the end of last year, which to me was incredibly important, because if we're going to have governance across the three levels of government and the private sector, there's no point doing that if you haven't got goals and measures. And it's pretty simple. What gets measured gets done. And I'd encourage you all to take a look at that. It'll evolve. It was designed so it can. It's digital. We need to find new data sources feeding into that over time. But this is crucially important. And what I know for sure is that smart cities, which we're all still struggling to define, but smart cities broadly defined will play a hugely important role in getting to a lot of those outcomes.
can I just quickly do while we're maybe queuing up another question, can I get a show of hands, a quick survey? Hands up if you have heard of the joint project between Smart Cities Council and Green Building Council of Australia called the Code for Smart Communities. Can I have a show of hands? So 0.02% of you. Okay, we'll have to work on that. Going to the point about the definition, that's exactly what that resource and document is doing, which is clearly defining via a set of principles and metrics what smart urban development is. So let's all take that offline. Any other, Frankie?
Frankie from the Property Council. I work with representatives of property companies, so they're risk managers, who are now starting to contemplate how they design buildings for security, both physical and virtual, and the built environment being that bridge between the two. So I'm curious whether you've got examples of countries or places where that's been done really well, because we're getting to the situation where a serviceman could go into a plant room to service a chiller and hack into a building's network and access, private data. I think that's a challenge that's fairly unique to the built environment. So interested in any ideas you've got.
Anyone? Adam, go.
So a quick response to that, or the first thought, is that buildings are now providing services far broader than, shelter. And as we think of mobility as a service, so we're starting to think about buildings as a service. Therefore, a building might be collecting energy, it might be recycling water and waste. It's going to be a huge repository of data and information, and it is also a place to live or do business. So this is where I think thinking about a building as a smart building as one of the first building blocks of a smart city is a good place to start. And it also highlights the risks and the other challenges of designing buildings of the future. We were having a discussion, in fact, last year with Telstra about what would a building of the future look like down in Fisherman's Bend, and someone said, "Oh, well, where's the takeoff point for the AirPod, which is like the person moving drone to get you to the airport, so you're not stuck in traffic?" And someone else said, "Oh, they're already designing for that in the UAE." So there are cities around the world that are already thinking about next generation buildings, and that goes to cybersecurity, energy consumption, the whole range of things.
Yeah, it's a great question. I can give you lots of good examples of having done the ministerial wing in Parliament House, I've got to tell you. And if you go around the embassies, I won't pick on individual embassies, some of the embassies in Canberra, they've done it extremely well for reasons that might probably obvious. How do you do that more generally is the tough question. And this is, when I talk about the cybersecurity side of this and the privacy side, because they're linked, this is one of the big questions over the next little while, because if we have networks that are vulnerable, where there's backdoors, there's huge amounts of very personal data here coming from your personal gadgets and your home. This is going to break the trust, which Merrick talked about so articulately. It will break it very, very quickly. So we have to get this stuff right, or else we might be making progress, but we'll go backwards. One of the really interesting opportunities for Australia is actually to link the security and privacy side of what we're doing with technology into smart cities. I think that's a big opportunity, and I think we're really well positioned to do it, along with countries like probably Israel's pretty good at this as well.
The counter has turned from green to orange, so I suspect we're on our way out. Any other questions from the floor via mic? Yes? Hello.
Yeah, Andrew Heaton from Sourceable. Just wondering, what positive impact do you guys think smart cities will have specifically for the environment in terms of environmental performance of our cities?
Great question.
Can I take that and build on the question from earlier
Yes.
in terms of energy security? There's a lot of conversation globally happening, and certainly a lot of action on the ground in Australia, I would say, in closed loop buildings, but also clusters of closed loop buildings, and the trend towards self-sufficient cities. So that applies to the way we are using and recycling our water at the precinct level, catching that, making sure that our buildings are actually recycling that. But it also applies to how we are clustering and working together with multiple sources of energy. So, for example, not just taking energy out of the grid or distributing it through microgrids, but also working in combination with other energy sources like solar glass that's storing the energy, so that you have a fallback system should one source be unreliable or subject to cloud coverage, etc., other security threats. And I do think that the key to there really is collaboration and looking at these as micro economies in order to be able to really get that impact back for the environment.
Just a quick response from me. Before I walked in here, I was hanging out around the common space area, and there's one of the exhibitors called Buddy Platform out there. If you haven't gone up to have a look at what that is, that's the Internet of Things, which is fundamentally going to change building performance. So I encourage you to have a quick look at that. Sarah, are you standing up to ask a question? Or no, you're the photographer. Who's that? Oh, Jeff. How are you, Jeff? You've hung back for the third question, not the first.
I'm going to just ask
We've got 50 seconds, Jeff.
An extension on the last question, which was about energy. Tell me how you think that smart cities can help overcome some of the preventative health problems that we have, getting people to get more exercise, healthier environments, etc.
Adam's jumping straight into that response.
So
you've got 30 seconds.
So two things. You've stolen my thunder on the first, but the cooling effect of greener cities has a huge benefit for environment, and also the design of mobility, including walking and other traditional options. And combined with wearable technology, I think we're going to know a lot more about the health of our citizens. So a huge opportunity.
Merrick, you were clearing your throat. Were you ready to say something? No?
Yeah, I think I was going to say, just back to that broad question about environment, I think transport and mobility is a guerrilla opportunity for us. If you think about how much time we all spend in traffic as a nation and the environmental impact of that, and the kind of impost that is going to be on us in the next few years to spend big on infrastructure, to add another lane, to add another road, we just can't do that. There are smarter ways to do that, and those will have a very significant impact on our environmental footprint as a nation.
So, folks, we're out of time. It's gone red, it's stopped. I'd like you to join me in thanking our panel.
Wonderful. You are released. You're free. You're free. Take those beautiful tan shoes and tap dance off the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, great insight, warmth and energy in that panel. Nicely done. Please join me in thanking the Honourable Angus Taylor, Merrick, Meredith, Adam and Adam again. And now that he's safely out of the room, I do note that while cruel wags through recent history have said that politics is show business for ugly people, it is nice to occasionally see a sort of Matthew McConaughey level of federal parliamentarian, isn't it? Right there, folks. And equally seriously, I do want to thank him for making the time. He's a big supporter of our industry, Angus. We're feeling the love. So thank you again to associate sponsor Arup as well for sponsoring that. Please join with me one final time. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our next session, Chatting with the Chiefs. Please welcome to the stage our moderator, here to help us avoid any sitting bull. He is the Ken Morrison, Chief Executive, Property Council of Australia.
Thanks, Mike. Welcome, everybody. Well, a lot of the conversations we have around sustainability in this country tend to be conversations with ourselves. So this session is giving us the opportunity to open that up and learn from the experiences from other jurisdictions, other countries, and reflect on what we can learn and also what we can give back. So to do that, I'm delighted to be able to introduce 4 CEOs of some of the longest standing green building councils around the world. And I invite them up to the stage as I call them. So the first up is our very own Romilly Maju. Give her a big round of applause. Second up is Sundaresan Ragapathy, who's the director of the Indian Green Building Council. Give Raghu a big welcome. Dora Madisi is the Chief Executive Officer of the Green Building Council of South Africa. And from across the ditch, we have Andrew Eagles, Chief Executive of the New Zealand Green Building Council. Give them all a big welcome. So here we have India, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia. It's the cricket-playing Green Building Councils, ladies and gentlemen. So let me toss a few in the air, see if I can invite them down the wicket and get some slashing drives through the covers. Of course, it's not just a spectator sport. You can slap your pads on and take part in the conversation either by SMS or the old-fashioned way. So let's get into it. We've had a really amazing thing happen in the world in recent years, and that's the Paris Climate Change Agreement. So I'm really interested from each of you how real that is being felt in your countries. Is it real for governments? Is it real in the business community? Andrew.
Thanks, Ken. Well, I hope to be able to support the discussion with some gut tool batting to the boundaries. I can say that the national government, the previous government in New Zealand, was fairly tempered in their approach. So they were looking at a 30% reduction on carbon commitments. Now, we've had a new government. You've probably heard of Jacinda, but she's also been joined by New Zealand First and the Greens, and they're looking at establishing a Zero Carbon Act with 5-year targets, but a far deeper analysis of what our built environment can deliver in terms of health and reduced surface water runoff, other benefits to society. So we're seeing a few more boundaries being hit to the boundary at the moment. The ball's hit to the boundary. And that's happening 2018, so 2019 would expect more traction.
Great. Dora?
Okay, thank you very much. South Africa has been really instrumental in crafting the Paris Agreement. And in Paris, we were chair of the G18 in China. Those who are affair with the negotiations would know it's like the largest negotiating bloc. And coming out of Paris, what we've seen is that the government of South Africa is really pushing the implementation of the NDCs and working with industry. And for us specifically as the Green Building Council, we have partnered with government in the implementation of emissions reductions programs within the property sector itself. So there is much ambition. Business is really even starting to catch up, you know, as you would know. In most instances, decisions that are taken at multilateral level would take time to trickle down to business and private sector. However, with the Paris Agreement, it's been quite different. And we are quite excited that there is even demand from within the property sector itself for more targets to be taken up. We are really moving forward with the whole net zero program and have been overwhelmed with a number of organizations that wanted to come in and be part of the piloting phase. So.
Raghu?
No, after Paris Agreement, India has taken enormous leadership role in 2 activities. One is the Indian government has committed for 35% reduction on emission intensity by 2030 with the base as 2005. This for a developing country like India is a very significant target. And this initiated a concept of solarization of the entire Indian power sector. We are very gung-ho about solarization. Right now, when the Indian government decided on a target of 175 gigawatts by 2022. And today, we have already achieved about 68 gigawatt of solar energy. The fundamental reason why this has happened is a strong thrust on policy. Second, the cost of solar power has come down. We are now talking about somewhere around 6 to 7 cents per unit, and the cost of installation has also come down. So there is a significant amount of solarization taking place. As a part of the Paris Agreement and as a part of the World Green Building Council, the Indian Green Building Council has also committed that we will achieve 10 billion square feet of green building footprint by 2022. There is a word 2022 means it is 75th year of Indian independence. That's a very important milestone for India. So,
so 10 million, and where are you now? What have you got to go?
We are right now, our target is 10 billion square feet.
10 billion?
10 billion square feet.
With a B.
Yeah, of green building footprint. We are today about 4.8 billion square feet of registered green buildings.
So more than doubling.
which is a significant growth when compared to what we started in 2003.
Yeah.
So this has been a phenomenal change. This has happened because the cost of green buildings have come down. Then there is a tremendous amount of uptake of green buildings from the industry perspective, and this has pivoted a major change within the sector. Thank you.
And I'm interested in the balance between where the drivers are the drivers government, or the drivers the property sector, or is it a bit of both? What are you seeing? Yeah, I go.
No, I think so the fundamental objective is the job of the government is to govern. The business of business is business. So that has been the approach of the Indian industry. So both the real estate sector as well as the Indian manufacturing industry have taken tremendous leadership on this aspect. By and large, the Indian Green Building Council is made by the Indian industry perspective, and the entire 4.8 billion square feet has been achieved in private sector. Of course, we do have a lot of government buildings that would account only for about 5% or 7%, but bulk of the 95% of the green buildings have come from the private sector. And that's where the major construction also happens. And this has been a variety of things. Another very interesting thing is not only in building sector, it has spread across all sectors of industry. For example, the Indian cement industry, believe it or not, is one of the leaders in energy efficiency in the entire world. If you see the specific energy consumption of Indian cement industry, it's about 61 units per ton of cement. Whereas the best in the world, which is Canada, which is Japan, they're all talking about 80 units per ton of cement. India is way ahead. This is in spite of the fact that India does not have anything on technology with respect to cement industry, but India has been the leader in adopting the technologies. So this has been the change. And one is the driver, then it makes business sense. That's how we are pursued. Thank you.
And Dora, I think you're describing government-led more in South Africa. Is that how you see it? Or
yes,
where have been the drivers in the business community?
The push is still very much coming from government, and different sectors are catching on as and when the right times comes. And within the property sector, I must say that we are starting to see industry leading. So it depends on the different sectors, and there are different dynamics to it. You still have sectors that are pushing against climate change mitigation efforts, and in most instances it would be due to social issues. Like as early as yesterday, we had the National Union of Mine Workers protesting against the signing in of independent power producers because they are against renewable energy. Right. Mainly because coal is still so vast within the country. Yeah. So you have those pushes in that if you want to go net zero, move away from coal power generation, but there is still that issue of huge unemployment levels and those groupings that would want industries that are more prone to employment. So we are still very much on a catch-22 situation with regards to the move. Yeah.
So Rom, the Australian experience is we've had lots of industry leadership, which has been great, and we've had lots of leadership from state governments, in some cases local governments, but the federal politics has been a bit diabolical. When you look around the world and you do your travels and you speak with your colleagues, where are you seeing the industry leadership really stepping up to the plate very strongly? What countries are you seeing that in?
The World Green Building Council has done a great piece of work called Advancing Net Zero, and the original GBCs who were involved in that, obviously Australia was one of them, is UK, Germany, Canada. So, when you talk about Canada, it's interesting that, and Chris Pike, don't kill me because he's from the US Green Building Council, it's interesting that Canada has taken the lead more so than I think the US. And each of them have been for separate reasons, but I think the driver is definitely coming from industry in the examples I've just given you, and as we've seen in Australia. I think the other thing is Australia is possibly leading in this area, and I'm not just saying it because I'm sitting here, but if you look at the carbon positive roadmap that we've worked with the industry, you know, we've been doing that for 18 months. If you look at the work that you chaired in high performance, low carbon high performance that we did with ASBEC a number of years ago, Australia's just jumped on board. They saw the signal of Paris and they moved, and many of our members in Australia have targets to 2030. So there's a lot of competition amongst the Green Building Councils, but it was the original group that signed up to Advancing Net Zero who I think is showing some real leadership.
Yeah. Andrew, so in New Zealand. So you've had the government hasn't been pushing that. Has industry been driving things over the last government?
Yes, I can say there have been. So we don't have energy performance certificates for homes, which are mandated through most of the OECD. We don't have mandatory reporting on energy performance of buildings. We don't have government requiring Green Star on their new build buildings. So there's lots of opportunity. I can say that the private sector has been leading in some of this. So we have, Satish from Argosy here, for instance, and some of the REITs are saying we will be looking at neighbours for all of our existing buildings and showing leadership. We had 23 of the larger chief executives from the larger companies sign off on calling for government to lead on this. So there's real opportunity. We've got some local government leadership. So through their land owning, they've led on moving residential build to Homestar, our standard, which is at least 20% warmer, it's resilient to climate change. And so we've now got 20,000 homes going through that. That creates a platform for moving on the building code. But very much we are competitive with these guys, and it's great to be here and sharing best practice. Would dearly like to be beating some of my companions on the stage here more. I think we've got a good place on residential, but we've got a way to go and a big opportunity on health, on reducing climate change impacts on our built environment. 42,000 buildings to go at. We can provide that opportunity for government and others.
Mm. Dora, a lot of the conversations around climate change and energy, but water's been a huge issue in South Africa, which has hit our news here as well. But what's the Green Building Council doing directly with industry, but also saying to government around these things?
Oh, yes. For us, yes, over and above energy, there's quite a number of challenges. And the government has recently declared drought as a national disaster, where we have come to a situation where Cape Town, one of the major cities, is literally out of water, and people are on restrictions of 50 litres per day of water. And now with that in mind, what we had done when we did a local context around net zero was to really look at what our South African needs. It's not just about energy. So our net zero program looks at 4 categories, and it's energy, it's water, waste, as well as ecology. All those in an over-encompassing way. And you would find that in different areas, organizations will prioritize different elements. And on top of that, we've had to, in 2016, introduce a socio-economic category as well, because now just talking about water and energy in a South African context without looking at the socio-economic issues around job creation, integrating previously disadvantaged communities in your project would be really self-defeating. So we introduced that, and what we are finding is that it's quite difficult to implement because private sector still views socio-economic issues as part of CSR programs. And CSRs for most people in private sector, it's about supporting a school there, building a hospital elsewhere, rather than integrating within own construction projects. So that is like an ongoing piece of work where we need to be entrenching it within implementation of programs. So it's quite difficult because green is no longer just green, it's just about emissions reductions and efficiency savings and resource protection, but then it's also about the communities that are around that area. How do you deal with those communities? How do you ensure that people are engaging with not just your employees, but people around are engaging with your buildings, your building, your project, and your deliverables.
Raghu, can I just build on that? So social sustainability, is that on your agenda with the Green Building Council?
Yes, it's very much on the agenda. We have 3 forms of coverage on social responsibility from a Green Building Council perspective. First, we have what is called affordable housing concept. We have a green affordable housing concept. Second, we have a concept of green schools. Then we have a concept of green villages. these three rating systems, we have 3 rating systems specifically addressing these points. And India probably the only council which has a green affordable housing rating system and the green village rating system. Now let me focus on affordable housing. Affordable housing is a concept that was introduced very recently, and the rating was also introduced very recently. And as on today, if my records are right, we have certified about 5 projects as green affordable housing. The beauty of the affordable housing is it meets almost all the water criteria, energy efficiency criteria, etc. But it is done at a very affordable cost. We are talking about 25 Australian dollars per square feet. That doesn't include land cost, because land is always given as a subsidy by the government. So we are talking about 25 Australian dollars per square feet, which is almost a mind-blowing figure, one of the lowest in the world. And so this has been achieved by technology interventions, by labor cost reduction, by going for cheaper local material, and this has been delivered. And now the Indian industry is expanding this activity in a very big way. So Indian Green Building Council has taken a leadership role in this activity. The second is in terms of green villages. Green villages are very unique to India. India has got lakhs and hundreds and thousands of villages. And the initiative is villages by nature are green. You do not have to do anything with that. By appearance, they are green. But their sanitation standards may not be adequate. Their water conservation standards may not be adequate. So the green village rating involves industry adopting the villages, industry adopting the green schools, and making them greener. And so far, we have certified about 14 villages as on today as a green school. And we are now also in the process of certification of green schools. Almost 120 schools have been certified. And all have been adopted by the industry in the CSR model. Thank you.
Let's start taking a few questions. So if people have any questions in the audience, please stick your hand up and I'll come to you. We've got a question just up here, if we could get a microphone there. While the microphone's coming, let's just take a few off the screen. So energy, well, the challenges for governments to mandate high energy efficiency within the built environment. So to what extent is regulation being moved up in your countries?
Well, I mean, I take that as an opportunity, actually. We saw, following insulation of existing homes, we saw a 30% drop in frequent flyers to Canterbury District Health Board. So those are people who come time and time again into hospital, costing millions of dollars. We saw a 50% drop in asthma rates in Gisborne and East Coast region. And I think a really key go-to point is the Harvard University study on health and well-being, showing that when you have green verified buildings versus a high-spec building, you get over a 20% uplift in productivity.
Yeah.
Why is that good? Well, it's good because we all want productivity. We want to get more out of our staff. We want our staff to be happier. You know, us, for instance, we've had low productivity for 10 years. It also led to deeper sleep. You know, has anyone here got young children? Right, so quite a few people nodding. Would you like deeper sleep? Yes, right? So I've got small children. Deep sleep is really vital to me, feeling the pain. So I think these things, and what's exciting about those things is those point to things that government are really interested in. It taps into something aside from green: health, productivity, well-being.
Great.
Okay.
Perhaps if you could answer that and also feed off this one, whether you've...
Yes, I've read 2 questions that I'd like to respond to. I mean, firstly, our government, I must say, is now sending mixed messages. We've taken a few steps back with regards to encouraging energy efficiency practice. 10 years ago, we had the most advanced energy efficiency program in the world, the demand side management program. However, over the time, then the National Electricity Utility commissioned more coal-built generation. So at the moment, they are saying there's excess capacity because they didn't even oversee the fact that corporates are now moving off the grid. There's a lot of solar-powered rooftops. There's a lot of embedded generation. So there's excess capacity. So energy efficiency messaging from the government side has gone to a 0. Even at national level, they've killed off the energy efficiency units because they need people to use more coal-based electricity, which is quite unfortunate. Now, on the issue of public awareness, especially in light of the drought disaster that we've just had, it's just been amazing that now suddenly individuals are demanding more efficiencies, we have had incidents where even, you know, in gyms, people are holding each other accountable. So like in Cape Town, everyone has got a limit of a 1-minute shower, not longer than 1 minute. And there has been fights in shower rooms where if they realize you're in a shower for more than a minute, literally they drag people out. So it's unfortunate fights, but at the same time you see it as it's a public awareness thing. It's in people's faces. So awareness programs and adverts are out there. So what we are then doing as the Green Building Council, together with other organizations similar in nature, is leveraging on that and pumping out the messaging that says it's not just about water, and putting the climate change agenda forward. So we are going to start to see more pull factors, demand from employees, from customers for more efficient ways of doing things.
Great. Let's go to these questions on the floor. The first up the back there, please. And just say who you are and where you're from.
Yeah, Andrew Heaton from Sourceable again. You've talked about what the industry and what government are doing. I guess my question is, what specifically do you see as being the role and function of green building councils themselves in making a practical, on-the-ground difference? You know, if we were to wake up tomorrow and there were no more green building councils anywhere in the world, why would we be practically impacted at a practical level?
Rom, do you want to take that?
Yes, thank you. Andrew, I think it's where we have a fundamental difference, that we're not constantly doing the business case around green buildings, and we're not constantly having to re-talk to politicians and the community about what green buildings are. And in Australia, we're only just touching the iceberg realistically when it comes to the impact that we've had. And so when we don't exist anymore, it's because it's just business as usual, and every building in the built environment is a green building, however that's defined, whether that's Green Star, Neighbours or ISCA. And, you know, I think that would be globally what you'd be looking for, and I think we're a long way off from that. And so the aim of the Green Building Council of Australia is to transform the built environment and to give them the tools that they need to ensure that we get that outcome that we're looking for.
Let's go to Jeff.
If you look back in 5 years' time about what's happened in your countries, and there's been either great success or great failure in the green building world, can you talk a little bit about what that would be? I mean, in other words, what are you hoping you will be able to achieve with us all in the next 5 years, and what are you fearful that could prevent that happening?
Can I start quickly on that I hope that you realise that carbon neutral, zero carbon, carbon positive, however you want to define it, is coming, and that you're not fearful of it, and that by what did you give me, 5 years?
5 years, yeah.
So 2023, that we are building and designing to it, that we're having proper conversations about how it can be achieved, that the roadmap that we put out you're not fearful of, and that as an industry we've come so far, and that you just see this as another stepping stone and you embrace this change. And that means the building code does the same thing.
Raghu?
Yeah. I think one thing is very clear. The green building in all the developing countries as well as developed countries, it's a very evolving market. Things are changing. One thing that has changed in the last 5 years is that from green building, from buildings it has become a built environment. That is a significant change that has happened. Now, the direction is very correct, and from our perspective, and we see immense potential, and there's a greater acceptance and adoption of the green building concepts and green built environment concepts. Now, the biggest challenge, and that's also one of the questions posed in what's the big challenge for India? In the sense that India, it's of course geographical from our perspective. It's a very large country. We have more than 200 or 300 cities. And there is a difference in each city. Each city is a different level in terms of evolution, in terms of standard of living, in terms of quality of life, in terms of adoption of technologies. So there is a difference. Now our biggest challenge is how to bring all together, how to make the green building movement widespread within the country. So having said this, the first attempt we have done is we have the only country in the world which has very successfully running what is called chapters. We have 23 chapters as on today, and by 2022 we are talking about 60 chapters. All mega cities, big cities which are having a population of more than 0.5 million people will have a chapter. The job of the chapter is to champion local green building movement there and spread the awareness on green buildings, showcase latest trends and practices, and information sharing, work closely with the government, and so that the green building takes a deep at a grassroots level. So this is the type of initiatives we are doing. It is not only chapters, but we are also looking at chapters in the colleges and schools also. We have what is called the student chapters. As on today, we have 150 student chapters, all managed by the professors and the teachers and the students. The students take the voluntary role, and they are also part of the Indian Green Building Council. Now we are trying to spread this movement. By another 3 to 5 years from now, we are going to have 1,500 chapters, about 100 cities. We are having city chapters. I think this is the route we are trying to take. This is a mass movement which is happening across the country. And when the cost of green buildings coming down, this becomes a natural process. Thank you.
A very bottom-up approach. Dora, 5 years, what's success look like?
For me, in the next 5 years, what I would like to see and what I see as a major success factor is that currently the office sector is leading in South Africa, and that sector is starting to just self-regulate. The competitive forces are really pushing for green building. And now I'm looking toward all of the sectors doing that. We've just entered the residential market now, so in the next 5 years, I'd like to see it in a position that the commercial office sector is at the moment. What is the major threat that I'm seeing? Africa has become a lucrative market for green, actually for anything, because there's so much room for development. And South Africa is still a gateway into Africa. So in as much as we've positioned ourselves as an African mouthpiece around green building and working with African countries, we are starting to see more competitors coming in from other countries, my fellow GBCs, entering the South African market. And my challenge is that when we do green building standards and certification as GBCSA, we do local context, we contextualize it, and we are very strict with those requirements. Now, when you get the foreign green rating agencies coming in, it waters down a bit on what we are trying to do, because it tends to compromise on the local context a bit. So that is a bit of fear that I'm having.
And Andrew, very quickly, success in 5 years?
So 5 key points. One is having a trajectory to zero carbon for homes and buildings. We are part of net zero also. We should be setting that out. I think the low carbon high performance report was brilliant. Great work from you, ASBEC, Climate Watch and others. I think government should be leading with their own buildings, new and existing homes and buildings. I think labelling is really important. So I was in the UK 14 years. People producing new appliances said that energy labelling wouldn't do anything. People selling appliances said it wouldn't do anything. Consumer groups said it wouldn't do anything. But in the case of 3 years, you saw 70% of consumers buying A-rated appliances. Why? Well, it wasn't because they care, it wasn't because they actually give a damn, it's because A denotes quality. So we need labelling on all existing buildings, on all existing homes, and we are taking up Green Star Performance, which Green Building Council of Australia has led so brilliantly on. 2 other points. One is the financial markets. Shouldn't all bonds be green? Are we just offering up a fig leaf to the bond markets by allowing them to provide 1% of the bond markets being green? Is that letting them off the hook? Fifthly, we should be talking, it should be health or better buildings. And 6th, we should beat Australian cricket, the whole series.
So
Thanks.
there we are. That circle has come back to where we started from very elegantly. And Andrew, that will never happen. Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's been a great tour.
We will see.
That'll be a great tour through a whole bunch of different perspectives, some very interesting countries with some very interesting leaders. Ladies and gentlemen, please join with me in thanking Andrew, Dora, Raghu and Romilly.
Thank you, Ken. Very well done. And I'm pleased to say the jury is in. more than justified. Your existence is to be celebrated, Green Building Council. So thank you, Andrew, Dora, Raghu, Romilly and Ken once more. Please join with me in giving them a big round of applause. Now I see handsome Jorge is down here. He's ready, before we break for lunch, to come and give us an update. No, Romilly, the lady in red, has leapt to her feet.
You're welcome. No, you do it, Jorge.
Oh, there's so much collegiality in the air, it's overwhelming. Jorge, known to many of you, obviously Head of Market Transformation at the Green Building Council of Australia, and genuinely awesome human being, will provide an important update about the future of Green Star. Please make him humongously welcome.
It's rare that someone calls me handsome. Anyway, thanks, Michael. Where'd you go? Well, it disappeared. Thank you very much. I'm going to start by making it a very simple statement. In the beginning, there was Green Star. And 15 years ago, we launched the first version of the rating system. It was the first time Australia had a clear definition for best practice and world leadership for an office building. Soon after, the first building got certified, 8 Brindabella Circuit. It was an exciting time. We then had the iconic buildings, right? 30 The Bond, this amazing building with a great sandstone facade, and the very experimental CH2 right here in Melbourne. These were fantastic examples of people really trying to get to that best practice and world-leading standard. Soon after, we started getting many more. We then, after some time, released the latest version of Green Star 4 years ago in 2014. 4 universal rating tools for the entirety of the built environment. New buildings with design and as-built, new fit-outs with Green Star interiors, existing building and operations with Green Star performance, and of course precincts with Green Star communities. And that was a very exciting time as well. Industry truly embraced these rating tools. We went at the end of 2014 from having 650 buildings to now essentially having 1,000 more in a few short years. There's now 1,750 certified Green Star rated buildings. That's a great number, and it's a testament to all of you really rising to the occasion. Let me break it down in some other fun numbers and statistics. There's going to be about 50,000 people living in Green Star rated apartments very soon. There's going to be 500,000 people moving into Green Star rated communities by the end of the decade. You know, that's an incredible achievement. Let me keep going. There is 36% of the office sector in Australia is rated. That's 725,000 people that go to a Green Star rated office every single day. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about Australia's favorite pastime, shopping, at which point we get 1.3 million people going to a Green Star rated shopping center to do their groceries. Those are phenomenal numbers from any way you look at. So we've been asking ourselves, what's next? Where do we go from here? And what does the future look like? And that's a really exciting proposition. We've been looking at all of the trends. We have everything from climate change to globalization to digitalization. These are things that are driving industry in a way we're not seeing before. And we're seeing a lot of emphasis being put into the built environment in a way that's being demanded more and more of. Everything from trying to address climate change and reducing emissions to creating better places to live in. And so our vision looks to that future. We want healthy, resilient, and positive places for people in the natural environment. That's GVCA's vision of what the future should look like, which makes me really excited to say that the next version of Green Star will be future-focused. Right? We want your support as we set out to redefine what best practice looks like and what world leadership looks like again. We did it for green buildings. We think it's time to do it for sustainable buildings. And it's an exciting time to be looking at what we do. So the first of 2 announcements that I'm making today is the release of a vision document that is now live on our website that talks about what the future of Green Star looks like. We need your support as we redefine best practice and world leadership. We need your support as we expand Green Star's scope into social sustainability issues. Because we want resilient places. We want places that work for everyone. We want better buildings. But more importantly, we want buildings that tackle the biggest problem that we're facing, which is climate change. We want all of the buildings to be part of the solution to this target. And this comes to the second announcement, which is a small, brief executive summary, a teaser, if you'd like, about our carbon positive roadmap. For the better part of a year, we've been talking to people about what it means to be carbon positive and how we're going to hit the target that we set out last year of no new building emitting carbon by 2030 and no existing building emitting carbon by 2050. Because we want carbon positive buildings. We want buildings fully powered by renewables. In fact, every 6-star rated building should be fully powered by renewables as soon as possible. And yes, Jeff, they should be airtight. But we also want all Green Star rated buildings to get to this point. So by 2030, we believe that no new building or no existing building that has a Green Star rating should emit carbon emissions. That's an important consideration, and we should go further. We should look at every emission in a building, including embodied carbon, emissions from refrigerants, and emissions from the transport sector. This is the time that we're looking for your support to make this happen. I mentioned briefly about the vision of the future that we look like, and I'd like to take 10 seconds just to get there and describe it. We do think we want buildings that enhance a person's health and well-being. I think that's a given. We want buildings that are resilient to shocks and stresses. We want buildings and places and communities that really get us to deliver attractive, culturally diverse and inclusive communities. Right? We want buildings that are powered by renewables that emit no carbon. And we want buildings that bring nature back to our cities. This is the vision of the future that we're trying to bring through Green Star. But it cannot be our vision alone. And in fact, it's not. We've gotten to these two documents thanks to the support of all of you. As I see around the room, I see a lot of members of our Green Star Steering Committee, our technical advisory groups, our industry advisory groups, expert reference panels, and a lot of people who attended all of the consultation sessions that we took for Carbon Positive Roadmap. So I would appreciate it if all of you gave a big round of applause to yourselves. Because this vision cannot be ours alone. The only way that we're going to do this is by working together. And it is by working together that we'll definitely deliver a vision of a healthy, positive, and resilient future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jorge, and a big round of applause to you too. Great update. And now we are racing against that fiend, old Father Time. Quick advertorial. Ever wanted to win a heart or a mind? I see him up the back there, Tim Gartrell. Maybe you want to win a plethora of hearts and minds. You'll find out how in our intimate fireside chat with campaign guru Tim Gartrell at 2:05 p.m. sharp. Lunch is in the foyer. We're progressing to Word Association, Lend-Lease Coffee Cart, Liberty One Still Bike and Blend Wood Solutions display, Blue Scope Gelato stand, Low Carbon Living display, QPS Geothermal display, and the Telstra exhibit. 40 minutes. Go, go, go! Thank you.